They will not communicate. They won't return calls. They will blow us off. They will tell us they'll call us back. They will allow access, but they make the showing so unpleasant for a buyer intentionally. So the biggest challenge with selling a home during a divorce is that we have got two people with competing agendas who we've got to get to the finish line. And, when we think about these competing agendas, they tend to fall usually one of three buckets. So number one is spite. So just out of sheer reasoning that the other side wants to get this property sold, the other side is going to absolutely say no to whatever it is. These two people do not agree on the color of the sky. So if one says blue, the other one says it's not blue. So it's strictly out of spite. And a lot of times what we see is, in the spite bucket, what we see is somebody who a lot of times bleeding financially, like the person who's responsible for making the mortgage payment, especially if we have somebody who is living in the home, but they're not responsible for making the mortgage payment. It's the other spouse that is making that mortgage payment. And they're literally being bled dry financially because they've got to pay for their own housing. And then they still have to pay for the marital home. So the person who's living in the house knows this. And so just out of pure spite, they just are fine letting that wound deepen and keeping that pain alive for the other spouse. So it's really, kind of pain driven. That's one reason. Another reason that we tend to see is grief. I mean, at the end of the day, this is the demise of a family, the demise of a marriage. They may still very much be in love with the other person. They realize that their children are going to be suffering, that their life is going to be changing, and they're just understandably, they're stuck in grief. And so that's a big reason, is just their response to that. And then the third reason is usually somewhere surrounding fear. So it's maybe they don't have the financial resources. Maybe they don't have the money to be able to, move into something that is comparable to what they're used to living in. Maybe they are afraid because they've not had to take care of themselves before. Maybe they've not had to manage money. Maybe they've not had to, they've not been independent. So there's a lot of fear in having to go out on your own, financial or otherwise. So usually, these are the three reasons why we see the clients not being on the same page. So, and then when we look at how this shows up, it shows up in ways like the most common is sales sabotage. They will not communicate. They won't return calls. They will blow us off. They will tell us they'll call us back. There's just a flat out non-communication. Sometimes they communicate, but they refuse to cooperate. They'll answer the phone, but they'll say, no, I'm not signing the offer. No, I'm not signing your listing agreement. No, I don't agree with that. And they will sometimes even, come up with ridiculous terms that, we're only going to agree if the buyer pays for this, and this, and, they increase their offer by 10% or something that's just not realistic. Another way that sales sabotage shows up is when the party who lives in the house, when they deny access. So either they won't allow us in it, they will deny showings, they refuse to allow showings, they refuse a lockbox, they, anytime we get any kind of a request from a buyer to go see the home, it's either ignored or it's denied. They also can refuse access for home inspectors, appraisers, these sorts of things. So when your home goes on the market, it becomes like a storefront of sorts. So access to the properties, necessary. And so they will sometimes limit the access. And other ways is, they will allow access, but they make the showing so unpleasant for a buyer intentionally. So they may, leave the house a complete mess. Maybe they will leave, dogs running around in the house, or they will have pet feces all over the place. The house might stink, maybe they'll be home and they are just rude to the buyers and the buyer's agent. So all of these things, they're off-putting, right? To a buyer, they don't want to put an offer in on a home like that, especially when they go down the street and they go have a pleasant experience in a beautifully staged home. This is how we see these things tend to show up. And it's, these are kind of textbook cases of challenges that we have with clients who are looking to sabotage the sale and in a divorce situation. But, as an agent, what do we do with this? It can be very maddening because we're not used to dealing in a regular transaction. We're dealing with, if they're a husband and wife or a couple, they don't have competing agendas. They have the same agenda. So now we've got this other situation, and it can be rather maddening to know how we need to deal with it. But I would say, number one, expect it in a divorce. So know that this is oftentimes the case in a divorce case. Agents that want to get into this business, sometimes are not prepared for the reality of what it brings. But secondly, the more we are allowed ourselves to develop trust and rapport with our clients, the better chance we're going to have to getting them to ultimately agree. It's important that we have empathy for what they're going through. We need to remain neutral. That's what a lot of agents have a hard time reconciling. How can I remain neutral yet still have empathy? You can, and you should, but it's important that we, validate what they're going through. And I certainly understand your position. I understand that this is tough for you. And, we need to move this forward. So it's important that we don't also lower our standards. We have somebody who says, I'm going to dig my heels in and I am not going to allow the house to be shown other than Tuesday from 2 to 3 o'clock. We can't let that be the dictator of how we're going to conduct the listing. It's not in the client's best interest for that to happen, certainly. So we have to make sure that we work with our clients, we have empathy, we develop that trust and rapport by listening to them, by validating, I understand you feel this way. Doesn't mean I have to agree with you. That's where the neutrality piece comes in. Doesn't mean I have to agree with you, but I understand that this is your position. And I understand that you're going through a tough time. And, at the end of the day, if none of these things work, and sometimes they don't, sometimes we just have clients who absolutely will not respond to any of our, efforts, it will need to be taken before the court. The court has a lot of power. And the sale of the house in a divorce is under the court's jurisdiction typically. And so the court can actually order that the clerk of the court sign all paperwork on behalf of the spouse who is not cooperating. They can actually order the person living in the house to be removed from the property. So those are extreme circumstances. And I certainly don't like to see cases that get that far. But in a divorce case, the reality is that the court does have that power. So we try to do everything we can to prevent us from having to go that far because it can feel a rather draconian. But nevertheless, if the court's ordered the property sold, then they need the property to be sold. And that is indeed kind of a last ditch remedy. And, what makes it even more complicated is when we have a buyer who has come along and now we've got a client who's acting up. We've got to keep that buyer engaged. We have to make sure that we don't let them see us sweat a lot. And we have to keep the buyer on the hook so that they've got like the confidence to keep going through all of these delays. So anyway, it's not an easy task, but, with the right skill, the right training, the right mindset, the patience, these things, will get across the finish line. And so I just encourage anybody who is wanting to get into the niche as a professional to obtain the training and build your skill set so that you can effectively work in these environments. I would highly recommend anybody who's going through a divorce that you enlist the services and hire someone who's qualified and trained to work in these environments because they're very complicated. But nevertheless, it's very rewarding work. And so if you are interested in any further training, please just continue to follow. I'm happy to share all of my experience with you and subscribe here to my YouTube channel.